You feel overwhelmed by workplace pressures that seem to multiply daily, and every setback shakes your confidence and disrupts your peace of mind. The stress is affecting your sleep, your health, and your happiness outside of work, while you watch others maintain their composure under similar pressures, leaving you wondering if you're losing your ability to cope with professional demands. I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history, and bearing the weight of millions of lives during plagues, wars, and constant political upheaval. The Stoic principles I developed through my personal meditations gave me a fortress of calm that no external pressure could penetrate, allowing me to make clear decisions when the fate of Rome hung in the balance. What I discovered about mastering your mind will transform how you respond to any workplace stress or professional challenge, using the same philosophy that sustained emperors through the darkest times and greatest responsibilities. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner strength has spread. I never wanted to be emperor. When Antoninus Pius adopted me and named me his successor, I felt the weight of the purple cloak before it ever touched my shoulders. I was a philosopher, content with my books and contemplations, suddenly thrust into a role that would demand everything I had and more. The night before my coronation, I couldn't sleep. I walked the marble corridors of the palace, my footsteps echoing in the darkness, and I felt the crushing weight of what lay ahead. 60 million souls would depend on my decisions. Wars would be fought at my command. Lives would be lost or saved by my judgment. The magnitude of it nearly broke me before I even began. When dawn came and they placed the purple cloak on my shoulders, I understood something that no amount of philosophical study had prepared me for. External circumstances have the power to overwhelm us only if we let them. The weight I felt wasn't from the cloak, it was from my resistance to what was already inevitable. My first months as emperor were a disaster of anxiety and second-guessing. Every decision felt monumental. Every meeting left me drained. I would lie awake, calculating the consequences of choices I had made, wondering if I was destroying the empire through incompetence. The senators watched me with calculating eyes, testing my resolve, probing for weakness. The weight of their expectations added to my own self-doubt until I could barely function. That's when I remembered the teachings of Epictetus, my old tutor. You are not your circumstances, he had told me years earlier. You are your response to your circumstances. But knowing this intellectually and living it under the crushing pressure of leadership were entirely different things. I began to develop what would become my daily practice of morning meditation. Before the servants woke, before the first petitioners arrived, I would sit in my private chambers and remind myself of fundamental truths. I am responsible for my thoughts, my choices, my responses, nothing more, nothing less. The empire will face challenges, whether I worry about them or not. My anxiety adds nothing productive to my decision-making. Slowly, something began to shift. The external pressures remained the same, if anything. They intensified as barbarian tribes pressed our borders and internal political tensions mounted. But my relationship to these pressures changed. I learned to see them not as burdens to bear, but as opportunities to practice virtue. Each difficult senator became a chance to practice patience. Each military crisis became an opportunity to exercise practical wisdom. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. There were days when the old anxiety returned, when the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. But gradually, through daily practice and constant self-examination, I built what I came to think of as an inner citadel, a fortress of calm that external storms could not penetrate. This is what I want you to understand: the pressures you face in your work, the stress that keeps you awake at night, the anxiety that follows you home, These are not punishments or signs of weakness. They are your training ground for developing inner strength. Every difficult colleague is your opportunity to practice compassion. Every unreasonable deadline is your chance to practice discipline under pressure. The purple cloak I wore was a symbol of external authority, but the real power, the only power that matters, was the authority I learned to exercise over my own mind. This is the sovereignty available to every human being, regardless of position or circumstance. You may not rule an empire, but you can become emperor of your own thoughts and responses. Nothing could have prepared me for the plague that swept through the empire in the early years of my reign. The Antonine Plague, as historians would later call it, killed millions of my people. I watched helplessly as entire cities emptied, as trade routes collapsed, as the very fabric of Roman civilization threatened to unravel. The disease arrived with my returning armies from the eastern campaigns. What should have been a victory, celebration became a nightmare as soldiers brought death into the heart of the empire. Within months, Rome itself was in chaos. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be burned. The wealthy fled to their country estates, abandoning the city to its fate. As emperor, I was expected to have answers, to provide solutions, to somehow stop a force of nature that respected neither rank nor virtue. The pressure was unlike anything I had experienced. Senators demanded action while offering no useful counsel. Citizens looked to me with desperate eyes, expecting miracles I could not provide. Military commanders needed orders for situations no general had ever faced. I remember one particularly dark night, standing on the palace balcony, looking out over a city of the dying. The smell of funeral pyres filled the air. The silence between the moans of the suffering felt heavier than any sound. I felt the weight of every death as a personal failure. How could I call myself a leader when I was powerless to protect those who depended on me? That night, I nearly broke. The rational part of my mind knew that plagues were natural phenomena, that no human power could stop them entirely. But the emotional part of me, the part that felt responsible for every Roman life, was drowning in guilt and helplessness. I stood there contemplating whether I was fit to rule, whether someone else might handle this crisis better. Then I remembered a fundamental Stoic principle that Epictetus had drilled into me. We suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. The plague was a fact, terrible, devastating, but simply a fact. My judgment that I should somehow be able to stop it was what created my additional suffering. The plague was killing my people. My self-recrimination and despair were killing my ability to help them. I realized that my anguish, however understandable, was a luxury I could not afford. While I was paralyzed by guilt over what I couldn't control, I was neglecting what I could control, organizing relief efforts, maintaining order, making the practical decisions that might save lives, even if I couldn't save all lives. From that night forward, I practiced what I came to call productive acceptance. I accepted the reality of the plague without accepting defeat. I focused my energy on what remained within my power, ensuring food distribution to quarantined areas, maintaining essential services, keeping the government functioning even as officials fled or died. This crisis taught me that inner peace is not the absence of external chaos. It's the ability to think clearly and act effectively despite external chaos. The plague raged for years, but I learned to find a kind of strange calm in the center of the storm. Not the calm of someone who doesn't care, but the calm of someone who cares so deeply that he refuses to waste energy on anything that doesn't help. Your workplace pressures may feel overwhelming, but they are not plagues. The deadlines that stress you, the conflicts that drain you, the uncertainties that keep you awake, these are manageable challenges, not existential threats. If I could maintain inner peace while watching an empire die and be reborn, you can find calm in the midst of your professional storms. The key is the same. Focus on what you control, accept what you cannot, and never waste your mental energy fighting reality itself. The most liberating discovery of my life came during a sleepless night in my military tent on the Germanic frontier. I was tormented by thoughts of failure, convinced that my decisions had led to unnecessary deaths, certain that I was inadequate to the challenges facing the empire. These thoughts circled through my mind like vultures, each one reinforcing my sense of hopelessness. Then, in a moment of exhausted clarity, I had a realization that changed everything. I was observing these thoughts. If I could watch them, step back from them, examine them like external objects, then I was not identical to them. The thoughts were happening in my mind, but they were not my mind itself. This insight revolutionized my understanding of human consciousness. For years, I had believed that my thoughts were simply true, that if my mind generated a worry or fear, I had to take it seriously and respond to it. But that night I understood that thoughts are like weather patterns in the mind. They arise, they persist for a while, and they pass away. Our mistake is in identifying ourselves with this mental weather. I began to practice what I called thought observation. Instead of immediately believing or fighting my thoughts, I would notice them with curiosity. There's a thought that I'm a terrible emperor. Here's a worry about tomorrow's battle. Now there's a fear that the senators are plotting against me. This simple act of labeling thoughts as thoughts, rather than as facts about reality, created space between my essential self and my mental chatter. The practice wasn't easy at first. Thoughts, especially negative ones, have a magnetic quality that pulls us into identification with them. When my mind told me I was failing as a leader, every instinct urged me to either believe it completely or fight it desperately. Learning to simply observe these thoughts without being consumed by them required constant practice. I discovered that thoughts are remarkably similar to physical sensations. When you have a headache, you don't think I am a headache. You think I have a headache. The pain is real, but it's not your identity. The same is true for thoughts. When anxiety arises, you don't have to think I am anxious. You can think I am experiencing anxious thoughts. This distinction might seem subtle, but it's the difference between freedom and slavery. When you believe you are your thoughts, you become their prisoner. When you understand that you are the awareness that observes thoughts, you can choose which ones deserve your attention and which ones you can simply let pass. In practical terms, this meant that when my mind generated catastrophic scenarios about the empire's future, I could acknowledge these thoughts without being paralyzed by them. My mind is offering me a worry about barbarian invasions. That's interesting. Is this worry helping me make better defensive preparations, or is it just creating suffering? Usually, it was the latter. The freedom this brought was extraordinary. I was no longer at the mercy of every mental fluctuation. I could experience doubt without being destroyed by it, feel fear without being controlled by it, have negative thoughts without believing they defined my reality. This is the foundation of all mental freedom. Understanding that you are not your thoughts. You are the conscious awareness that experiences thoughts, observes them, and can choose how to respond to them. Once I understood that I was not my thoughts, I faced a new challenge: how to build a reliable refuge from the constant mental storms that accompany leadership. I needed what I came to call an inner citadel, a fortress of calm that no external circumstance could breach. The inspiration came from studying actual military fortifications. A well-designed fortress has multiple layers of defense: outer walls to slow attackers, inner keeps for final retreat, and secure supplies that can sustain the defenders during any siege. I realized that the mind needed similar architecture. My practice began each morning before dawn, in the quiet hours when the world still slept. I would sit in my private chambers, not as emperor, but simply as a human being seeking wisdom. This wasn't prayer to the gods, though I respected them. This was something more practical, the deliberate construction of mental strength. The first layer of my inner citadel was what I called morning preparation. Like a general briefing his officers before battle, I would review the day ahead and prepare my mind for likely challenges. I would remind myself that whatever happened, whether senators opposed my policies, whether bad news arrived from the frontiers, whether unexpected crises emerged, possessed everything I needed to respond. With virtue, I would specifically visualize difficult scenarios and practice my responses. If the Germanic tribes launched a surprise attack, I would remain calm and think strategically. If a senator challenged my authority publicly, I would respond with dignity rather than anger. If plague claimed more lives, I would feel the appropriate grief without losing my ability to function. This mental rehearsal wasn't pessimism, was preparation. Just as soldiers drill in peacetime to be ready for war, I drilled my mind in quiet moments to be ready for chaos. When actual challenges arose, I had already practiced the emotional and intellectual responses they required. The second layer was what I called the retreat protocol. No matter how intense external pressures became, I always knew I could withdraw. To my inner citadel, in the middle of heated Senate debates, I would take a mental step back and reconnect with my core principles. During military campaigns, I would find moments of solitude to remember who I was beneath the imperial roles. This wasn't escapism, quite the opposite. By having a secure inner retreat, I could engage more fully with external challenges. When you know you have a safe harbor, you can sail into rough seas with confidence. When you trust your ability to find inner peace, you can face outer chaos without being overwhelmed. The third layer was my evening reflection practice. Each night, I would review the day like a student examining his work. Where had I acted according to virtue? Where had I fallen short? What could I learn from the day's challenges? This wasn't self-punishment, but self-education. The gradual refinement of character through honest self-examination. Most importantly, I learned that the inner citadel wasn't a place of isolation, but a foundation for authentic engagement. The stronger my inner peace became, the more genuinely I could connect with others. The more secure I felt in my core identity, the less I needed external validation. The clearer my inner vision became, the better I could serve the empire's real needs rather than my ego's demands. Your workplace may feel like a battlefield, but you can build the same kind of inner fortress. Start with morning preparation, develop your retreat protocol, and practice evening reflection. Build these habits gradually, and you'll discover that no external pressure can touch your essential peace. Asterisk. The most dangerous enemy I faced as emperor wasn't the Germanic tribes or political rivals, it was my own unchecked desires. I learned this lesson painfully during the early years of my reign, when I found myself constantly wanting things to be different than they were. I wanted the plague to end immediately. I wanted senators to support my policies without debate. I wanted military campaigns to conclude quickly with minimal casualties. I wanted the empire to run smoothly without requiring difficult decisions. Most of all, I wanted to return to my philosophical studies and leave the burdens of leadership to someone else. These desires seemed reasonable, even noble, but I discovered they were chains that bound me to suffering. Every moment I spent wishing reality were different was a moment stolen from dealing effectively with reality as it actually existed. My desires weren't just unproductive, they were actively harmful to my ability to lead. The breakthrough came when I realized that desire itself isn't the problem. Attachment to desire is. One could prefer that the plague end, but when I demanded that it end, I created internal conflict that served no one. I could hope for senatorial cooperation, but when I required it for my peace of mind, I gave my emotional state hostage to forces beyond my control. I began practicing what I called the discipline of desire, the systematic training of my wants and preferences. This wasn't about becoming emotionless or indifferent. It was about distinguishing between preferences and demands, between hoping and requiring. The practice started with small things. When I preferred warm weather but faced a cold day, I would notice my desire for warmth and then consciously release my attachment to having it. When I wanted a particular meal but was served something else, I would practice finding satisfaction in what was provided rather than frustration over what was missing. This might sound trivial, but these small exercises built the mental muscles I needed for larger challenges. When news arrived that a trusted general had been killed in battle, I could feel genuine grief for his loss while accepting the reality that death is part of war. When senators opposed legislation I believed would benefit the empire, I could advocate passionately for my position while accepting that the outcome wasn't entirely within my control. The most profound shift came in my relationship to being emperor itself. For years, I had fought against my role, constantly wishing I could return to private life. This resistance created a constant background tension that colored every decision and interaction. When I finally accepted that I was emperor, not grudgingly, but fully, everything changed. Acceptance didn't mean passive resignation. If anything, it freed me to be more effective. When I stopped wasting energy fighting my circumstances, I had more energy available for working skillfully within them. When I released my attachment to outcomes, I could pursue goals with greater clarity and less anxiety. I learned to distinguish between three categories of desire: things I could directly control, my thoughts, choices, and responses; things I could influence but not control, other people's decisions, political outcomes, military results; and things entirely beyond my influence, natural disasters, aging, death. The discipline of desire meant aligning my wants with these realities. For things I could control, I allowed myself strong preferences backed by committed action. For things I could influence, I worked skillfully while holding outcomes lightly. For things beyond my influence, I practiced acceptance without giving up appropriate emotional responses. This practice transformed not just my inner experience, but my effectiveness as a leader. People responded better to an emperor who was passionate, but not desperate, committed but not attached, caring but not controlling. When you master your desires, you ironically become more capable of achieving worthwhile goals. The hardest decision I ever made as emperor was to leave Rome and march north to fight the Germanic tribes. I was nearly 60 years old, in poor health, and desperately wanted to spend my remaining years in philosophical study. But the barbarians were threatening the empire's northern frontier, and duty demanded that I lead the campaign personally. Every fiber of my being resisted this choice. I had served as emperor for over a decade, and felt I had earned the right to delegate military commands to younger generals. My body ached from years of stress and responsibility. The philosophical works I wanted to complete called to me more urgently than any trumpet summoning soldiers to battle. But I had learned something crucial about action during my years of leadership. Virtue requires doing what must be done, regardless of our personal preferences. The discipline of action isn't about forcing ourselves to take any action, it's about aligning our actions with what virtue demands, even when virtue is inconvenient. The night before departing for the Germanic frontier, I sat in my study surrounded by scrolls of philosophy. Part of me hoped that if I could just solve enough theoretical problems, I could somehow avoid the practical problems waiting in the north. But I realized I was using philosophy as an escape from life, rather than preparation for living. True philosophy, I understood, isn't abstract speculation. It's practical wisdom applied to real circumstances. All my years of studying Stoic principles meant nothing if I couldn't embody them when action was required. The empire needed an emperor who would do what duty demanded, not a philosopher who merely understood what duty demanded. The march north was brutal. My aging body protested every mile. Rain turned roads to mud that sucked at our wagon wheels and exhausted our horses. Scouts brought news of tribal movements that required constant tactical adjustments. There were 1,000 moments when I could have turned back, delegated command, found reasonable excuses to return to the comfort of Rome, but I had learned to separate the discomfort of action from the necessity of action. My body's protests didn't change what duty required. My preferences didn't alter what the empire needed. The discipline of action meant moving forward based on principle rather than feeling, on virtue rather than convenience. In the campaigns that followed, I discovered something remarkable. Right action creates its own energy. When we act in alignment with virtue, even difficult actions become easier to sustain. When we resist necessary action, even small tasks become overwhelming. The Germanic tribes were formidable enemies, but the real battle was internal, the ongoing choice to do what must be done rather than what I wanted to do. I learned to find a strange satisfaction in duty fulfilled, regardless of personal cost. There's a clean feeling that comes from acting according to principle, a sense of integrity that no external reward can provide. When senators criticized my extended absence from Rome, when my health deteriorated from campaign conditions, when homesickness threatened to overwhelm me, I could always return to this foundation. I was doing what virtue required. The discipline of action also taught me the difference between activity and right action. Many emperors stayed busy with ceremonies, banquets, and administrative details while avoiding the difficult decisions that actually mattered. Being busy isn't the same as being effective. Right action requires the courage to focus on what's essential, even when essential tasks are unpleasant. This principle applies directly to your professional life. Every day you face choices between what's easy and what's right, between what you prefer and what virtue demands. The discipline of action means consistently choosing virtue, even when virtue is difficult, inconvenient, or unrewarded. Success comes not from doing what you want to do, but from wanting to do what must be done. When you align your will with virtue's requirements, action becomes not just effective, but deeply satisfying. One morning during the Germanic campaigns, a messenger brought news that hit me like a physical blow. My beloved son, Commodus, had been killed in battle. The grief was immediate and overwhelming. I felt my world collapse as images of his childhood flooded my mind, teaching him to ride, watching him study rhetoric, hoping he might one day rule with wisdom and virtue. But as I sat there, destroyed by loss, something remarkable happened. A small voice in my mind asked a simple question: is this news actually true? I realized I had immediately accepted the messenger's report without any verification. In my shock and pain, I had given my full belief to information that might be inaccurate. When I questioned the messenger more carefully, I discovered he had confused my son with another young officer who bore a similar name. Commodus was alive and unharmed. This experience taught me one of the most important lessons of my philosophical practice. We suffer not just from events themselves, but from our judgments about events, and most crucially, we often suffer from judgments about events that haven't even occurred or aren't even true. I began developing what I called the discipline of assent, the practice of carefully examining my initial reactions and beliefs before accepting them as true. This wasn't skepticism for its own sake, but practical wisdom applied to the thoughts and impressions that constantly arose in my mind. The practice started with questioning my automatic interpretations of events. When a senator opposed my legislation, my first thought was often, he's undermining my authority deliberately. But was this necessarily true? Perhaps he genuinely believed his position would benefit the empire. Perhaps he was responding to pressure from his constituents. Perhaps he was having a bad day and reacting emotionally rather than strategically. I learned to hold my initial judgments lightly, like hypotheses to be tested rather than facts to be defended. This didn't mean becoming indecisive or endlessly second-guessing myself. It meant creating space between my immediate emotional reactions and my considered responses. The discipline was particularly valuable during military campaigns, where quick decisions could mean the difference between victory and defeat. When scouts reported enemy movements, I practiced distinguishing between what they had actually observed and what they interpreted those observations to mean. We saw large fires in the forest was fact. The enemy is preparing a major attack was interpretation that might or might not be correct. This careful attention to the difference between facts and interpretations saved us from several potential disasters. On multiple occasions, what initially appeared to be threatening enemy activity turned out to be neutral or even beneficial developments. By withholding immediate judgment, I could gather more information and respond more appropriately. The practice extended to my judgments about myself. When things went wrong, my mind would immediately generate stories about my failures as a leader. This defeat proves I'm incompetent. My decision-making is getting worse with age. I should never have become emperor. These weren't facts, they were interpretations, and often inaccurate ones. I learned to treat such thoughts as mental weather rather than divine revelation. My mind is generating self-critical thoughts right now was a more accurate and less harmful way to describe the experience than I am a failure. The first description left room for other possibilities. The second trapped me in unnecessary suffering. The discipline of assent became one of my most practical tools for maintaining emotional equilibrium. Instead of being immediately convinced by every thought that arose, I could examine thoughts with curiosity. Is this belief helping me or harming me? Is it based on facts or assumptions? Is it leading me toward virtue or away from it? This practice doesn't require becoming a philosopher. It simply requires the humility to recognize that our first impressions aren't always accurate, and the wisdom to pause before accepting them as truth. Asterisk. During the siege of a Germanic stronghold, I found myself overwhelmed by the complexity of decisions facing me. Supply lines were stretched thin, winter was approaching, and my generals were divided on whether to continue the siege or retreat. The pressure felt enormous. Thousands of lives hung in the balance, and the empire's northern security depended on my choice. That night, unable to sleep, I walked outside my tent and looked up at the stars. The sky was perfectly clear, and I could see the vast sweep of the Milky Way stretching across the darkness. In that moment, I practiced an exercise that had become essential to my mental well-being. I imagined myself rising up from the earth, higher and higher, until I could see our entire camp as a tiny cluster of lights, then the whole region, then the empire, then the known world. From this cosmic perspective, my agonizing decision looked different. Not unimportant, the lives at stake remained precious but contextualized within the vast scope of space and time. I was one man making one decision in one moment of an enormous universe that had existed for countless ages and would continue long after I was forgotten. This exercise wasn't meant to diminish the importance of my responsibilities, but to free me from the paralyzing anxiety that comes from taking ourselves too seriously. When we zoom out far enough, we can see our problems in proper proportion. They remain real and worthy of our best efforts, but they lose their power to destroy our peace of mind. I began using this view from above regularly, especially during moments of intense stress. When senators engaged in bitter political battles, I would imagine viewing their arguments from the perspective of someone floating high above Rome. The conflicts that seemed monumentally important at ground level looked like minor disagreements between tiny figures in a small city on a modest planet. The exercise became even more powerful when I extended it through time as well as space. I would imagine historians, centuries in the future, reading about our current crises. Which of today's urgent problems would they even bother to mention? Which of the issues consuming our energy would be remembered, and which would be forgotten entirely? This temporal perspective was particularly liberating. Most of the things I worried about, whether particular policies passed, whether specific senators supported me, whether individual military campaigns succeeded exactly as planned, would be historical footnotes at best. What mattered was whether I acted with virtue, whether I served the common good, whether I maintained my integrity under pressure. The cosmic view also helped me understand the temporary nature of all circumstances, both good and bad. When the empire faced serious threats, I could remember that all empires eventually fall. That change is the only constant, that even the mightiest civilizations are brief experiments in the cosmic story. This wasn't fatalism, but freedom, from the desperate need to control outcomes beyond my influence. Conversely, when things went well, the cosmic perspective kept me humble. Military victories, successful policies, and popular approval were temporary phenomena in an ever-changing world. They deserved gratitude, but not attachment, appreciation, but not ego inflation. The practice taught me that anxiety often comes from taking too narrow a view of our circumstances. When we're completely absorbed in immediate problems, they seem overwhelming. When we step back and see them in context, they become manageable challenges rather than existential threats. Your workplace stress, your career concerns, your professional disappointments, these are real and deserve your thoughtful attention. But they're also tiny events in an vast universe, brief moments in an endless timeline. This perspective doesn't minimize their importance to you. It frees you to address them with clarity rather than panic, wisdom rather than desperation. I am writing these words as a dying man. The Germanic campaigns have taken their toll on my aging body, and I know my time is limited. Far from being morbid, this awareness of mortality has become my greatest teacher and most reliable guide to right living. Most people spend enormous energy trying not to think about death, as if ignoring it could somehow prevent it. I learned to do the opposite. I made death my daily companion and advisor. Each morning, I would remind myself that this day might be my last. Each evening, I would reflect on whether I had lived the day in a way I could be proud of, if it were my final one. This practice, which philosophers call memento mori, remembering death, wasn't meant to create morbid obsession, but to clarify priorities. When you truly understand that your time is limited, you stop wasting it on trivial concerns. When you remember that everything you accumulate will eventually be lost, you focus on what can't be taken away: your character, your choices, your responses to circumstances. The awareness of death taught me to distinguish between what seemed urgent and what was actually important. Political gossip felt urgent when I was caught up in it, but from the perspective of mortality, it was meaningless chatter. Public criticism seemed devastating when I took it personally, but against the backdrop of death, it was just temporary noise. Most of the things that stressed me daily were revealed as distractions from what truly mattered. I remember a particular morning when news arrived that several senators were plotting against my policies. My first reaction was anger and worry. How dare they undermine the empire's stability for personal gain? But as I sat with the news, remembering my mortality, the situation looked different. These senators, like me, were temporary actors on a temporary stage. Their schemes, whether successful or not, would be forgotten long before the sun burned out. What mattered was not their plots, but my response to their plots. Death also taught me to hold success lightly. Military victories, effective policies, and imperial achievements felt important in the moment, but mortality reminded me that all human accomplishments are temporary. This wasn't cause for despair, but for freedom. If nothing lasts forever, then failure isn't permanent either. If all achievement is temporary, then I could pursue worthy goals without the crushing pressure of needing them to provide ultimate meaning. The practice became especially valuable during the plague years, when death surrounded me daily, instead of being paralyzed by the constant presence of mortality. I learned to see each death as a reminder to make the most of whatever life remained. Every funeral I attended reinforced the same message. Use your time wisely because you don't know how much you have. I developed a simple test for decision-making. If I knew I had only 1 year to live, would this choice still matter to me? Most of the things I worried about failed this test. Office politics, personal slights, minor setbacks, none of these would concern a man with only months remaining. But treating people with kindness, acting with integrity, serving the common good, these would matter regardless of how much time I had left. Death as teacher also revealed the absurdity of holding grudges. When you remember that both you and your enemies are mortal, conflicts lose their sting. The senator who opposed me today might be dead tomorrow, or I might be. Why waste precious life energy on resentment when that energy could be used for something constructive? Perhaps most importantly, mortality taught me gratitude. Each day I woke up was a gift I hadn't earned and couldn't guarantee. Each sunset I witnessed was a bonus. Each conversation with a friend was a privilege that wouldn't last forever. This awareness transformed ordinary moments into treasures. The ultimate deadline isn't your next project. Due date, it's your final breath. Keep that perspective, and suddenly your current problems become much more manageable. Asterisk, asterisk, every evening, when the day's official duties were finished and the palace had grown quiet, I would retreat to my private chambers for what became the most important hour of my day, the evening review. This wasn't prayer or ceremony, but a practical examination of my thoughts, actions, and character as they had been tested in the crucible of daily leadership. I would sit with a scroll and stylus, not to record history but to learn from it. The questions I asked myself were always the same. Where did I act according to virtue today? Where did I fall short? What did my reactions teach me about my character? How can I improve tomorrow? The practice began during my first year as emperor, when I realized that the constant pressure of decision-making was changing me in ways I didn't always notice. Small compromises in judgment, brief moments of anger or impatience, decisions made from ego rather than wisdom, these accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, gradually altering the course of my character. One evening stands out clearly in my memory. A young senator had challenged one of my edicts publicly, questioning my judgment in front of the entire assembly. My immediate reaction had been anger. How dare this inexperienced politician doubt my wisdom? I had responded sharply, using my authority to silence him rather than addressing his concerns substantively. Later, during my evening review, I examined this incident honestly. Yes, the senator had been disrespectful in his manner, but had his underlying concerns been valid? Was my angry response truly in service of the empire, or was it protecting my wounded pride? Had I acted like a philosopher emperor or like a petty tyrant? The answers were uncomfortable but clarifying. The senator's concerns had indeed been legitimate, even if poorly expressed. My anger had served only my ego. I had used imperial power to avoid intellectual engagement. In that moment, I had failed to embody the Stoic principles I claimed to follow. This recognition stung, but it also liberated me. By acknowledging my failure privately, I could learn from it. The next day, I arranged a private meeting with the young senator, listened to his concerns properly, and adjusted my policy based on his valid points. What could have become a festering resentment became an opportunity for wisdom and better governance. The evening review taught me that self-examination, when done honestly and regularly, is one of the most powerful tools for character development. We can't improve what we don't acknowledge. We can't learn from mistakes we don't admit making. Most importantly, we can't become virtuous by accident. Virtue requires intentional cultivation. I learned to examine not just my actions, but my motivations. It wasn't enough to ask whether I had made good decisions. I needed to understand why I had made them. Had I chosen a particular policy because it would benefit the empire, or because it would make me popular? Had I promoted a certain general because of his competence, or because of personal loyalty? The same action could spring from virtue or vice, and only honest self-examination could reveal the difference. The practice also helped me recognize patterns in my behavior. I noticed that I tended to make worse decisions when I was tired, that I was more likely to lose my temper when I felt overwhelmed, that I sometimes avoided difficult conversations by burying myself in administrative details. Once I recognized these patterns, I could create systems to counteract them. Most importantly, the evening review kept me humble. Each day brought fresh evidence of my imperfections, regular reminders that being emperor didn't make me wise, that wearing the purple didn't automatically confer virtue. This humility wasn't self-flagellation, but practical wisdom, accurate self-assessment that led to continuous improvement. The evening review isn't about achieving perfection, but about pursuing it with dedication and honesty. Each day offers new opportunities to practice virtue, and each evening offers the chance to learn from how we used those opportunities. Of all the challenges I've faced as emperor, none tested my philosophical principles more severely than dealing with difficult people. I'm not speaking of barbarian enemies or foreign threats. Those were straightforward military problems. I'm talking about Roman senators who seemed to oppose me for sport, advisors who gave counsel based on personal ambition rather than imperial needs, and generals who prioritized their own glory over strategic necessity. There was one senator in particular, call him Gaius, though that wasn't his name, who seemed to take personal pleasure in making my reign as difficult as possible. He would speak against my policies not because he had better alternatives, but because opposing me enhanced his reputation among certain factions. He would twist my words in public forums, spread rumors about my health and judgment, and rally other senators to resist initiatives that were clearly beneficial to the empire. My initial response was entirely human and entirely unwise. I wanted to crush him. I had the power to exile him, to strip him of his wealth, to make his life miserable in dozens of ways. The temptation was enormous, especially during late-night moments when his latest sabotage had cost me weeks of political progress. But my Stoic training suggested a different approach. Instead of seeing Gaius as an enemy to be defeated, I began to see him as a teacher sent to test my character. He provided perfect opportunities to practice patience, to maintain equanimity under attack, to respond with virtue rather than react. With anger, this reframing wasn't easy or immediate. When Gaius would interrupt my speeches with pointed questions designed to embarrass me, my first instinct was still to respond defensively, but gradually I learned to see these moments differently. Here was a chance to demonstrate that my policies could withstand scrutiny, that my leadership was based on reason rather than authority, that I could maintain dignity even when others abandoned theirs. I began to study Gaius as I might study a philosophical problem. What motivated his opposition? What fears or ambitions drove his behavior? What legitimate concerns might be hidden beneath his political theater? This investigation revealed something surprising. Many of his objections, while poorly expressed and politically motivated, contained kernels of valid criticism. This led to one of my most important insights about difficult people. They often serve as involuntary mirrors, reflecting back our own blind spots and weaknesses. Gaius's criticism of my policies forced me to examine them more rigorously. His challenges to my authority made me think more carefully about how I wielded power. His resistance to my leadership helped me develop more persuasive and inclusive approaches to governance. I developed what I called the practice of gratitude toward opponents. Instead of resenting Gaius for making my life difficult, I began to appreciate him for making me stronger. Each confrontation with him was like lifting weights, some pleasant in the moment, but building strength over time. Each time he tested my patience, I had the opportunity to develop greater patience. Each time he questioned my judgment, I could refine my thinking. This didn't mean becoming passive or allowing him to damage the empire's interests. I still opposed his harmful initiatives and countered his false accusations, but I did so from a place of calm strength rather than reactive anger. I focused on serving the empire's good rather than protecting my ego. I responded to his arguments rather than attacking his character. The transformation was remarkable. As I became less reactive to Gaius's provocations, he seemed to lose interest in provoking me. Political opponents respect strength more than they respect anger, and my newfound equanimity actually enhanced my authority. Other senators began to see the contrast between my measured responses and his emotional attacks, and gradually they shifted their support toward my positions. Most importantly, this approach allowed me to maintain my inner peace regardless of external conflict. I couldn't control whether Gaius chose to be difficult, but I could control how I responded to his difficulty. I couldn't change his character, but I could use his challenges to strengthen my own character. The same principle applies to your difficult colleagues, demanding bosses, and workplace adversaries. They aren't obstacles to your peace of mind, they're opportunities to develop it. They aren't threats to your success, they're training partners for building resilience, patience, and wisdom. During a particularly intense battle with the Germanic tribes, I found myself frozen by anxiety about the future. My mind raced with catastrophic scenarios. What if we lost this engagement? What if the tribes broke through our lines? What if this defeat triggered a broader barbarian invasion that destroyed the empire? The more I projected into potential futures, the less capable I became of dealing with the present moment that actually required my attention. It was then that my training in philosophy saved my leadership and possibly my life. I forced myself to return to what was actually happening right now. I was standing on a hill overlooking a battlefield, holding a sword, surrounded by loyal officers awaiting orders. The catastrophic futures I was imagining existed only in my mind, while the real battle, the only battle I could actually influence, was happening in this moment. I learned that anxiety is almost always about the future, while depression is almost always about the past. Both are forms of mental time travel that rob us of the power we have in the present moment. The Germanic tribes weren't going to conquer Rome in my imagination. They could only do it through specific actions taking place right now. My job wasn't to solve all possible future problems, but to respond wisely to current circumstances. This insight revolutionized not just my military leadership, but my entire approach to governing. I had spent countless hours worrying about potential political crises, imagining how various scenarios might unfold, trying to prepare for every possible challenge. While some planning is necessary, I realized I had been living more in hypothetical futures than in actual present moments. The present moment, I discovered, is where all real power resides. I couldn't change decisions I had made yesterday. Those existed only in memory. I couldn't control events that might happen tomorrow. Those existed only in possibility. But I could choose my thoughts, words, and actions right now, in this moment. And those choices would shape whatever future actually emerged. I began practicing what I called present moment returns. Whenever I noticed my mind wandering into past regrets or future anxieties, I would gently bring my attention back to immediate reality. What was I seeing, hearing, feeling right now? What choices were actually available to me in this moment? What action did virtue require of me today, not in some imaginary future scenario? This practice was particularly valuable during the long Germanic campaigns, when the temptation to escape into mental fantasy was strongest. Campaign life was often uncomfortable, boring, or frightening perfect conditions for the mind to seek refuge in memories of comfortable palace life or dreams of returning home. But these mental escapes weakened my ability to lead effectively in the field. Instead, I learned to find richness and meaning in present moment experience, even when that experience was challenging. The taste of simple campaign food became an opportunity for gratitude. The discomfort of sleeping in a tent became a chance to practice acceptance. The complexity of tactical decisions became a puzzle to engage with fully rather than a burden to escape from. The present moment also taught me about the illusion of multitasking. When I tried to handle multiple concerns simultaneously, I handled none of them well. When I gave my full attention to whatever required immediate focus, whether it was a conversation with a general, a review of supply reports, or a diplomatic negotiation, I was far more effective. I realized that presence is actually a form of respect. When I was fully present with someone, I was honoring their worth and importance. When I was mentally elsewhere, reviewing past conversations or planning future meetings was diminishing both them and myself. The same principle applied to tasks, giving my complete attention to whatever I was doing, even mundane administrative work, transformed it from drudgery into a form of meditation. Most importantly, I learned that the present moment is the only place where we can actually practice virtue. We can't be courageous yesterday or compassionate tomorrow. We can only embody these qualities right now. In response to current circumstances, your power doesn't lie in perfect planning for the future or in correcting mistakes from the past. It lies in how you choose to think, speak, and act in this moment. One of the most liberating discoveries of my philosophical journey was understanding the difference between what truly matters and what merely seems to matter. The Stoics taught me to categorize everything in life into three groups: good things, virtue, and wise choices; bad things, vice, and foolish choices; and indifferent things, everything else. This third category, what we call preferred indifference, changed how I viewed success, failure, and the entire imperial project. Wealth, health, reputation, political power, military victories, these were neither inherently good nor inherently bad. They were indifferent to my fundamental well-being as a human being. I could prefer to have them rather than lack them, but they couldn't make me a better or worse person. Only my choices about how to use them or respond to losing them could do that. This understanding was tested severely during a plague outbreak that decimated Rome while I was campaigning in the north. Messengers brought news that the city was in chaos, that my popularity had plummeted as citizens blamed me for being absent during the crisis, that political rivals were using the situation to undermine my authority. Everything I had worked to build seemed to be crumbling. My initial reaction was panic. My reputation, my political position, my legacy, all these seemed to be slipping away. But then I remembered the distinction between what I could control and what was merely preferred. My reputation was a preferred, indifferent nice to have, but not essential to my worth as a person. My political position was a preferred, indifferent, useful for serving others, but not the source of my identity. What mattered was how I responded to these challenges. I could choose to abandon my military duties and rush back to Rome to protect my image, or I could complete the necessary campaign and trust that virtue would ultimately be recognized. I could panic about public opinion, or I could focus on making decisions that truly served the empire's long-term interests. I chose to stay and finish the campaign, even knowing it might cost me politically. This wasn't stoic indifference to consequences. I cared deeply about the empire and wanted to serve it well. But I had learned to distinguish between caring about outcomes and being enslaved by them. The concept of preferred indifference also revolutionized my relationship with imperial luxury, the palace, the ceremonies, the deference of others. These were tools of office, not sources of happiness. I could use them appropriately without being corrupted by them. When circumstances required me to live simply in a military tent, I wasn't losing anything essential. When protocol demanded elaborate banquets, I wasn't gaining anything fundamental. This perspective protected me from the two great temptations of power: arrogance when things went well, and despair when they went badly. Military victories were preferred indifference, pleasant and useful, but not the measure of my worth. Political defeats were preferred indifference and pleasant and inconvenient, but not catastrophic to my essential self. The same principle applied to health. As emperor, I naturally preferred to be strong and vigorous, but illness didn't diminish my capacity for virtue. Some of my clearest thinking and best decisions came during periods of physical weakness, when I couldn't rely on energy and had to depend on wisdom instead. Understanding preferred indifference also changed how I dealt with criticism and praise. Both were external judgments that I couldn't ultimately control. I could prefer praise to criticism, but neither one determined my actual worth. What mattered was whether the criticism was accurate and could help me improve, or whether praise reflected genuine virtue rather than flattery. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to everything external. I still worked diligently to maintain my health, to govern effectively, to win necessary military campaigns, but I held these goals lightly, as preferences rather than requirements for peace of mind. The freedom this brought was extraordinary. When you understand that only virtue is truly good and only vice is truly bad, external circumstances lose their power to control your emotional state. You can engage fully with the world while maintaining inner stability regardless of outcomes. The greatest mistake of my early reign was thinking that leadership meant making all important decisions alone. I would retreat to my private chambers, wrestle with complex problems in solitude, and emerge with solutions that I expected others to implement without question. This approach not only created resentment among my advisors and generals, it also led to worse decisions than I could have made through genuine collaboration. The turning point came during a crisis with the Parthian Empire. Their forces had invaded our eastern territories, and I needed to decide whether to respond with full military force or attempt diplomatic resolution. I spent weeks agonizing over this choice alone, weighing factors I only partially understood, trying to anticipate consequences I couldn't fully predict. Finally, in frustration, I called together my most trusted advisors, not to announce my decision, but to genuinely seek their counsel. What emerged from that discussion was far superior to anything I could have conceived alone. The military experts understood tactical realities I had missed. The diplomats saw political nuances that had escaped me. The treasury officials knew financial constraints that should influence our approach. This experience taught me one of the most important lessons of leadership. We are not isolated individuals, but members of a community of rational beings. Each person brings unique knowledge, experience, and perspective. When we combine these individual contributions skillfully, we can achieve understanding and solutions that no single mind could reach alone. I began to see my role not as the sole decision-maker, but as the coordinator of collective wisdom. My job was to create conditions where others could contribute their best thinking, to synthesize different perspectives into coherent policies, and to take responsibility for final choices while drawing on the intelligence of the entire community. This required a fundamental shift in my ego's relationship to leadership. I had to become comfortable with not being the smartest person in every conversation. I had to learn to ask questions that revealed my ignorance rather than hiding it. I had to accept that others might have better ideas than mine, and that, acknowledging this strengthened rather than weakened my authority. The practice began with simple changes in how I conducted meetings. Instead of presenting my preliminary conclusions for approval, I would present problems for genuine discussion. Instead of asking, "Do you agree with my plan?" I would ask, "What factors should we consider?" Instead of defending my initial instincts, I would encourage others to challenge them. The results were remarkable. Not only did we make better decisions, but the people implementing those decisions felt genuine ownership of them. When generals helped design military strategy, they executed it with greater commitment. When senators contributed to policy development, they supported the resulting legislation more enthusiastically. I also learned that serving the community of rational beings meant considering not just immediate stakeholders, but future generations. The decisions I made as emperor would affect Romans not yet born, would shape institutions that would outlast my lifetime, would set precedents that would guide my successors. This expanded sense of community disciplined my choices in ways that personal ambition never could. The principle extended to my relationship with enemies as well. Even Germanic chieftains and Parthian kings were rational beings capable of wisdom, virtue, and growth. This didn't mean naive trust or avoiding necessary conflict, but it did mean approaching even adversaries with fundamental respect for their humanity. I discovered that when you genuinely see others as fellow rational beings, rather than obstacles to your goals, they respond differently. People can sense whether you view them as full human beings or as tools for your purposes. When they feel genuinely respected and included, they contribute more generously and creatively. This community perspective also provided comfort during times of isolation and difficulty. Even when I felt alone with impossible burdens, I could remember that I was part of something larger than myself, a community of rational beings stretching across space and time, all struggling with similar challenges, all capable of wisdom and virtue. Your workplace challenges are opportunities to practice this same principle. Every difficult colleague is a fellow rational being deserving of respect. Every team project is a chance to create collective wisdom. Every conflict is an opportunity to find common ground based on shared humanity. Asterisk, asterisk, the most important hour of my day wasn't spent in the Senate, on the battlefield, or in council meetings. It was the quiet hour before dawn when I prepared my mind for whatever challenges lay ahead. This morning practice became the foundation of everything else I accomplished as emperor and as a human being. I would wake while the palace still slept, before servants stirred or messengers arrived with urgent dispatches. In this sacred stillness, I would sit with my thoughts and deliberately set the tone for the day ahead. This wasn't ritual or ceremony, but practical preparation, like a blacksmith heating his forge before beginning work. The practice began with what I called morning remembrance, reconnecting with fundamental truths that the chaos of leadership often obscured. I am responsible for my thoughts, choices, and responses, nothing more and nothing less. External events are neither good nor bad in themselves. Only my judgments make them so. The only true security comes from virtue, not from circumstances. Death could come today, so I must live today with purpose and integrity. These weren't abstract, philosophical concepts, but practical tools for maintaining perspective under pressure. When a senator would challenge my authority later that morning, I could remember that his opposition was an external event, neither inherently good nor bad. When military dispatches brought news of setbacks, I could focus on my response rather than being overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control. I would then practice what I called day preparation, mentally rehearsing likely challenges and my intended responses. If the Senate meeting became contentious, I would maintain calm dignity rather than reactive anger. If advisors brought conflicting counsel, I would listen carefully to each perspective before deciding. If unexpected crises arose, I would remember that obstacles are opportunities to practice virtue. This mental rehearsal wasn't pessimism, but practical wisdom. Athletes practice movements repeatedly so they can perform them naturally under pressure. I practiced virtuous responses repeatedly so they would arise naturally under the pressure of leadership. The morning practice also included what I called gratitude inventory, deliberately recognizing gifts I often took for granted. I was alive and healthy enough to serve. I had been given opportunities to contribute to human flourishing. I was surrounded by capable people who could teach me and help me govern wisely. I lived in an age of relative peace and prosperity. This gratitude wasn't forced optimism, but realistic appreciation. Even during the darkest periods of plague and war, genuine blessings remained. Recognizing them didn't diminish the reality of problems, but provided the emotional foundation needed to address problems effectively. I would conclude each morning session by setting a specific intention for the day, not goals like win the Senate, vote, or receive good news from the frontier. These depended on factors beyond my control. Instead, I would set intentions like listen with genuine attention to each person I meet, or respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, or make decisions based on virtue rather than convenience. These intentions focused my attention on what I could actually control while providing concrete ways to practice philosophy throughout the day. When afternoon pressure mounted and I felt myself becoming reactive, I could remember my morning intention and choose a more thoughtful response. The consistency of morning practice created what I thought of as philosophical momentum. Just as physical exercise builds strength gradually through regular effort, daily philosophical exercise built mental and emotional resilience. Each morning's practice contributed to a growing capacity for wisdom, patience, and inner peace. Most importantly, the morning practice reminded me daily that I had a choice about who I would become. External circumstances might be imposed on me, but my character was my own creation. Each morning offered a fresh opportunity to live according to my highest values rather than my lowest impulses. Your morning routine doesn't need to replicate mine, but the principle remains the same. How you begin each day shapes everything that follows. A few minutes of intentional preparation can transform your entire approach to work and life. Asterisk. As I write these final reflections from my tent on the Germanic frontier, knowing that my body is failing and my time grows short, I can see clearly how the philosophical practices I've shared with you transformed not just my thinking but my entire being. This transformation didn't happen overnight, was the gradual work of years, built through daily choices and constant practice. When I first became emperor, I reacted to every crisis with internal turmoil. A senator's criticism would disturb my peace for days. Military setbacks would fill me with anxiety that clouded my judgment. Political opposition would trigger anger that served no constructive purpose. I was like a ship without anchor, tossed by every wind and wave. But philosophy, applied consistently over time, created what I can only describe as inner ballista, deep stability that external storms could no longer overturn. This didn't happen because I learned to suppress emotions or become indifferent to outcomes. Rather, I developed what the Greeks call ataraxian shakeability of mind that comes from understanding what truly matters and what doesn't. The transformation happened in layers, like sediment slowly forming rock. Early in my practice, I might remember Stoic principles after losing my temper during the evening review when it was too late to change my response. Gradually, I began catching myself in the middle of reactive moments and choosing better responses. Eventually, the practices became so ingrained that virtuous responses arose naturally. Without conscious effort, I remember a particular moment during the final years of my reign when this deep training revealed itself. News arrived that a trusted general had been killed and our entire eastern flank was collapsing. Years earlier, such news would have sent me into despair or rage. But as I received this devastating report, I felt a deep calm settle over me, not indifference to the loss, but complete clarity about what needed to be done. I grieved the general's death genuinely while immediately turning my attention to strategic responses. I felt the weight of the military crisis while maintaining confidence in our ability to adapt. I experienced human emotion fully while being guided by philosophical wisdom. This wasn't the suppression of feeling, but the integration of feeling with wisdom. This integration took years to develop and required constant vigilance to maintain. Even near the end of my life, I sometimes caught my mind wandering into old patterns of anxiety or resentment. The difference was that these lapses became temporary visitors rather than permanent residents. I could notice them, learn from them, and return to equilibrium without being derailed entirely. The practices I've shared, morning preparation, evening review, the discipline of desire, the view from above, these aren't quick fixes, but lifetime commitments. They work not through immediate transformation, but through gradual strengthening, like muscles developed through consistent exercise. Each day you practice them, you become slightly more capable of wisdom and virtue. Each day you neglect them, you become slightly more vulnerable to anxiety and reactive behavior. I've seen this gradual strengthening in my closest advisors who adopted similar practices. They became more reliable under pressure, more creative in solving problems, more generous in their responses to others, not because they were naturally superior people, but because they had trained their minds systematically over time. The long view also taught me that setbacks in practice are part of practice itself. There were periods when I abandoned my morning routine, when political pressures overwhelmed my philosophical commitments, when I acted more like a conventional emperor than a philosopher king. These weren't failures, but learning opportunities, chances to understand my limitations and renew my commitment to growth. What matters isn't perfect consistency, but persistent return to the practices that serve you. What matters isn't immediate transformation, but steady progress toward the person you want to become. What matters isn't avoiding all mistakes, but learning from each mistake and using it to build greater wisdom. The inner strength you develop through philosophical practice becomes a gift, not just to yourself, but to everyone around you. When you can maintain calm in crisis, others find their own calm. When you respond to hostility with patience, others discover their own capacity for patience. Your inner work becomes a form of service to the community of rational beings. Asterisk, asterisk, my time grows short, and soon the purple cloak will pass to another. But the sovereignty I want to leave you cannot be inherited through bloodlines or claimed through conquest. It must be earned through daily practice and unwavering commitment to virtue. I speak of the ultimate authority, becoming emperor of your own mind. This is the only empire that truly matters, the only throne that brings lasting satisfaction, the only crown that cannot be taken from you by external circumstances. Whether you lead armies or manage spreadsheets, whether you govern nations or coordinate meetings, whether you command respect through position or earn it through character, your most important responsibility is ruling yourself. Throughout my reign, I wore the symbols of imperial power, the purple cloak, the golden laurel, the ivory scepter, but these were mere costumes compared to the real authority I developed over my thoughts, responses, and choices. When barbarian tribes threatened our borders, the power that served me wasn't the legions under my command, but the discipline I had developed over my own fears and anxieties. When senators opposed my policies, the The strength that sustained me wasn't political alliances, but the inner fortress I had built through years of philosophical practice. The empire you must build is internal, but its effects will be entirely practical. When you master your responses to workplace pressure, you become more effective under stress. When you develop genuine patience with difficult people, you become better at collaboration and leadership. When you learn to focus on what you can control, while accepting what you cannot, you waste less energy on futile struggles and direct more attention toward productive action. This inner sovereignty doesn't require withdrawing from the world, but engaging with it more skillfully. The Stoic emperor isn't indifferent to outcomes, but free from being enslaved by them. You can care deeply about your work while holding your career lightly. You can pursue success passionately while defining success as virtue rather than achievement. You can engage fully with life while maintaining the perspective that comes from remembering your mortality. The tools for building this empire are simple but not easy. Morning preparation sets the tone for each day. Evening review builds wisdom from experience. The discipline of desire frees you from the tyranny of wanting things to be different than they are. The discipline of action aligns your behavior with your values. The discipline of assent prevents you from being controlled by thoughts and impressions that may not be accurate. These practices work not through magic, but through the simple truth that what you repeatedly do becomes who you are. Practice virtue daily, and you become virtuous. Practice wisdom consistently, and you become wise. Practice inner freedom regularly, and you become free regardless of external circumstances. But remember that this empire, like all empires, requires constant vigilance to maintain. There will be days when you forget your training, when pressure overwhelms your philosophy, when you react from emotion rather than respond from wisdom. These aren't failures, but reminders of why the work matters. Each lapse becomes an opportunity to recommit. Each mistake becomes a teacher. Each challenge becomes a chance to practice what you've learned. The mandate I leave you is this: accept complete responsibility for your inner life while working skillfully with external circumstances. Let virtue be your guide, wisdom be your counselor, and service to others be your purpose. Build the kind of character that can weather any storm while contributing to the common good of the human community. This is your imperial inheritance, not wealth or position or power over others, but the sovereignty that comes from mastering yourself. Wear this invisible crown with dignity. Rule this inner empire with wisdom. Leave a legacy measured not by external achievement, but by the depth of character you develop and the positive influence you have on every life you touch. The emperor's true purple is virtue worn daily. The emperor's real scepter is choice exercised wisely. The emperor's lasting monument is a life lived according to the highest human values. Now go forth and rule yourself with the wisdom and virtue worthy of the greatest empire ever established. Empire of a disciplined, compassionate, and free human mind.